Good morning, Honi Honi fam. My name is Bex and I am the owner of Honi Honi Surf Camps in beautiful Torquay on the Great Ocean Road in Victoria. Thank you for joining us for our video today where we're going to be talking about surf forecasts and about beach conditions and learning how to read them as best you can so that hopefully it'll save you some time not having to drive around to all the different locations to find out where is good on any given day. So there's three main things we're going to cover off in today's video. The first thing, I'm just going to give you a really brief physics/geography lesson talking about the beaches and what conditions have the most impact on our surf. And then number two, I'll be going into the biggest secret for actually getting good at reading surf forecasts and the beach conditions. And number three, maybe the most important bit, I'm going to go through the apps and websites that I personally check and our surf instructors check every day when we're deciding which beach to take our clients to, when we're deciding which beach to go for a surf ourselves. So they're the three things we'll be going through today. So we'll get straight into it. The first thing, our brief physics and geography lesson. Basically, our waves come from way out at sea. They're generated by the wind pushing across the ocean. And as the wind blows across the ocean, we get those lumps of water that we know as swell. That is called ground swell. We also have wind swell. I'm not going to go into that in depth today, but our ground swell is generally what we consider our swell. And as that pushes in towards shallower areas, so our beaches, reefs, rocks, any kind of shallower area, we've got all of that energy moving through, and as it rams up into something shallower, it makes our waves stand up, knock over, and that's where our breaking waves come from. Now that is a very overly simplistic explanation, but just so you get the idea, generally our waves are breaking where it's shallower. Now with those waves, depending on the ground underneath, if it's quite a gentle incline like Ocean Grove Beach, what happens is we get those beautiful gentle rolling spilling waves which are perfect for beginners, nice and cruisy, great for longboards, things like that. If we have quite a sharp drop off where it's down and then down, those waves can stand up very quickly and knock over. So there are faster breaking waves, usually our barreling waves. For example, Winky Pop has that reef there and it's quite a sharp drop, which means that our waves stand up much faster and you need to be more of an intermediate to advanced level to actually get up and ride along them. With our beaches themselves, they all face slightly different directions. So if you looked at any coastline around the world, but we're using the example of the South Coast in Victoria because that is where we're based, you'll see that there are many different beaches, many different directions and angles that they face. The way this affects our waves is that when we're looking at that swell, it is generally coming in from one direction. Now that direction can change, and we're not talking about swell directions today because generally it doesn't have as much of an effect on it as some of the other conditions we'll talk about. But when our swell pushes in, what it does is it actually refracts around some of those headlands. So if you think like sound waves might be a good example. As the noise moves, if you're yelling through a corridor, as the noise moves down, it will maybe still reflect into some bedrooms or other rooms, but it'll be quieter as it comes around. It's the same with our waves. It's energy and motion moving through. So, for example, Bells Beach and Jan Juc usually get more of a push directly from the swell, whereas Torquay is a little bit more in an angle, so the waves are a tiny bit smaller as it refracts around Torquay Point, Rocky Point I should say, into Torquay. And then the same thing further around the corner, as it refracts around into Cozy Corner in Torquay, the waves get smaller again. The reason this is important is because our wave height is obviously one of the three main things that impact whether the beach is good for us to surf at or not. So I would say it would be wave height, the tide, and the wind are the three main things that we want to look for when we're checking our surf conditions and our forecast. So the size of the waves is obviously going to affect us in that we want to be comfortable in our ability to manage those waves. So if we're still starting out, maybe 1 to 2 foot waves is perfect. There's not going to be too much sweep, there's not going to be much of a current, and the waves and the drop isn't going to be too intimidating, hopefully. Whereas as we get to intermediate or to advanced, maybe we start seeking those 3 to 4 foot waves, or 10 foot days, depending on your level for adrenaline, I guess. So that's why we kind of want to consider our swell. And the reason we need to know our geography is because a 5 to 6 foot day at Bells Beach might look like 5 foot or 4 to 5 foot at Jan Jack, and then coming around to Torquay, it might look like a 3 to 4 foot at Torquay, and that same swell wrapping around to Cozy Corner might be 1 to 2 foot. So what that means is by learning our geography, learning how the different beaches work on different conditions, there'll always be a beach that's suitable for for our level, but actually also how we're feeling on the day. So you might be an advanced surfer who has incredible stamina, but you're absolutely exhausted from a hectic week. And so maybe you want to choose a smaller beach just so that you're not having to fight as hard, give your body a bit of a break, but still get in the water. So many options. The other 2 things that we'll check for in our forecast and in our conditions, as I mentioned before, one is the tide. So when we're talking about the physics of that beach, when we're talking about the wave hitting against something shallow, obviously as the tide comes in, the water is deeper. And so it might change the way the waves break, because all of a sudden that initial shallow point isn't as shallow anymore. There's more water over the top, so the wave might not catch it until further up the beach. This can mean, for example, Torquay Beach, the tide really does affect the quality of the waves. So the Torquay Beach, it'll kind of drop down a bit quick, and then it's nice and gradual after that, which means on our low to mid tide, Torquay is perfect as a beginner's beach because the waves roll in relatively gently. As soon as we get more to that mid to high tide, that ground underneath is quite steep, and so it's more likely to dump and have those really big, fast dumping waves onto the shore, more of a shore break. And at high tide, sometimes you don't get a wave all the way up until the shore break. So there's not very much time to stand up or practice your standing if you're still beginning. So that's how our tide influences. Now, I've just given the example of Torquay, which works better on mid to low, but of course there are beaches that work better on the high tide. They have the opposite shape underneath. And then there are some beaches that are pretty good no matter what. So I would use Ocean Grove as an example for that one again. Ocean Grove Main Beach is pretty gradual the whole way out. The only disadvantage of a high tide is that sometimes the water comes all the way up to the fence, and that means that you have to avoid hitting the wall when you surf in. But in terms of wave quality, it's pretty good regardless of if it's high or low tide. And the third thing that we check is our wind. So we have, you would have heard offshore wind, onshore wind, cross-shore wind, maybe thrown around. Basically, this is describing what the wind is doing on the beach. So when I spoke earlier about the wind blowing across the ocean and creating our swell, that is not what I'm talking about. That is wind thousands and thousands of kilometers away. What we're talking about is the local wind on the beach where you actually are. And if you've been down to the beach on a windy day, you will know how hard it can be sometimes to control your board, to not have it go flying off every time you fall off a wave, all of those sorts of things. Now, our offshore wind is generally what we consider preferable. What it does is it blows back out to sea, so it's blowing offshore, and it blows into the face of our wave, which makes it hold up a little bit longer, sometimes make it a little bit cleaner, perfect for us as surfers to get along the face of those waves. If you're still riding whitewash, the direction of the wind doesn't matter as much. Our onshore wind typically blows onshore, so back towards the beach. Generally, we consider this our bad wind, as it blows and knocks the crest of those waves over, making them crumble a bit more. That being said, there are some beaches where that onshore wind might make them a little bit more beginner friendly, because it does knock the wave down a little bit if they're quite large waves. So it can have the opposite effect, it just depends on what you're looking for. But generally we like our offshore wind. Cross-shore wind is when the wind is blowing across the shore. Pretty self-explanatory. And that's generally where we get our choppy conditions. So that's really, as a beginner riding whitewash, maybe the ones you want to watch out for. If it's really strong cross-shore wind, you can be prepared for a little bit of that chop as you're out in the surf, and maybe also getting blown down the beach a little bit, not just moving with the current, but moving with the wind as well.